A search of more than 170 people still missing after flash floods devastated central Texas are searching into a seventh day as the death toll continues to rise. At least 120 people were confirmed dead as of Wednesday, according to local law enforcement and Texas Governor Greg Abbott. President Trump has signed a federal disaster declaration at Abbott's request, allowing the Federal Emergency Management Agency to deploy teams to support local rescue and recovery efforts as operations press on. Senator Ted Cruz spoke on the tragedy.
Now, when tragedy strikes, we ask ourselves what could have been done differently. And that's a question that we need to ask. In any crisis, there's an order that things play out. Stage number one is search and rescue, and that's got to be the first priority, saving lives, getting lives out of harm's way. Stage number two is recovery and rebuilding, and that's a process that takes months or even years as you go to the homes that are destroyed, you go to the buildings that are destroyed, and you look to rebuild. And we'll do that. Texas will rebuild. We're strong. But there's also a process of engaging in a retrospective and saying, what is the exact timeline of what transpired and what could we have done better? Look, every one of us looking at the flooding in Texas, if we could step into a time machine and go back to 2 or 3 in the morning on July 4th, we would rush into those little girls' cabins and get them the hell out of there. And so one question, Dr. Jacobs, you and I had a very good conversation in my office yesterday. I want to thank each of the nominees here for your expertise. But one question we will certainly be asking in Texas, and we ought to be asking across the country, is how can we improve the speed and rate of response that when an extreme weather warning goes out?
Earlier, I sat down with Andrew Donaldson from OrdinaryTimes.com for more on the devastating situation in Texas.
Andrew, thank you so much for the time today.
Always a pleasure, Theresa. Thank you.
Now, what do you make of the governor's comments about who is potentially to blame for this high death toll?
Well, we need to bifurcate what happened here with what happened before the storm and what happened after the storm. And the governor's right on a few points here. There is a lot of blame game shifting, and that's one of those things that probably ought to wait until we get all the people recovered and or rescued, although the latter seems to be fading by the minute. There's a lot of people still missing here and a lot of death and destruction to parse through. So he's right as far as the blame game goes. But at some point, we do need to have an investigation into this, especially now that we do have some facts on the ground. And we need to part out what is the government's fault and what isn't the government's fault. The act of God flooding stuff isn't the government's fault. The government, local, state, federal authorities, they knew the day before and the day before that even that there was going to be some kind of flooding. They just didn't know it was going to be this bad. We now know from the data that we've accrued that the worst of this flooding came up in the middle of the night, 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. period. And the worst of the flooding, they now have measurements where the river came up as much over 20 feet in some places in as little as 45 minutes to 1 or 2 hours. And this would be 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning on a holiday. People had their guard down. This is people that are camping. They got their guard down. This was kind of a perfect storm, to use a horrible pun, of bad things to happen. Now, how did the government react after that? That is open to interpretation, and the governor and the president and everybody else at the national, state, and local levels should be open to accountability and an investigation. But he does have a point here. We should probably get the bodies recovered first.
How do you interpret the Trump administration's public handling of this tragedy?
They've somewhat set themselves up for criticism here because of all the noise about FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management stuff. They've been talking about that for a while. So, when you politicize something like FEMA, which is a government function, which is something that does need to be reviewed for things like waste and how effective it is and how the money is used. But this goes to one of those core things in America. How does the federal government get money to local and state authorities in a time of disaster? The Trump administration has made a very big deal about the fact that they want to scale back FEMA, if not eliminate it, and push all that down to the states, and then let the states handle a lot of this. So when you have something in a state like Texas, very pro-Trump state, by the way, especially the governor and the leadership of the state politically, this is one of those things that goes right into what they were talking about ahead of time. That's where this criticism is opening up, and they kind of brought them down on themselves. Now, how much of it is fair is unfair? This is why you need a full investigation into what they knew, who did what to where. And again, it can wait until the bodies are recovered, but this is stuff that's going to be reviewed, but it goes right to the wheelhouse of what they're saying is the states can handle it. Could the states really handle it? That's what an investigation needs to reveal.
Now, with the Trump administration choosing to pull funding from FEMA, I don't like to ask questions about chance, but what is the likelihood that when a natural disaster happens again, because of course it will, how severe will it be because this funding has been pulled? Will more accidents like this continue to happen as severe as they have been happening?
Well, one thing we always have to be careful with within government is funding does not equal results, whether that is a disaster relief program or education or welfare programs or anything else, Department of Defense. Just because you throw money at it doesn't mean it's actually going to work efficiently.
Right.
That's one good argument. The other problem is when it's disaster relief, this is human beings and they get on TV and these are friends and loved ones and it's people's homes destroyed and it's videos of kids that are in trouble and all that there. That makes for very bad politics. So again, this is one of those core things of government money getting from the federal to the local levels, who handles it, who's in charge of it, and who bears responsibility when that money doesn't get there in time or in a expedient fashion to relieve people after the fact. Makes it for a very political hot button issue for something that, unlike a lot of politics that isn't life or death, this really was life or death.
And were there procedural failures that made this worse?
I think it's fair to say that we don't know yet. Now, we have some reporting on it. We need to have some sober review of all this. I think it's a little unfair to just jump all over the social media stuff, even though you get a little bit of things. But remember, things don't happen in a vacuum. They happen in a sequence. We know the Texas authorities and local authorities had stuff out as early as July the 2nd. We also know that the worst of the weather warnings started coming out about 1:30 a.m. and that this river came up very, very quickly between 3 and 5 a.m. Most people are just sleeping and it's a holiday weekend. That's just a whole lot of bad that's nobody's real fault. But once you get past that, you need to start investigating this and see who did what, who responded well, who did not respond well. And this is going to be a long recovery process of not only finding these folks over the next couple of weeks that are missing, but rebuilding this area. And the flooding really damages infrastructure like roads, waterways, things like that. That all has to be reviewed. That process also needs to be reviewed. And the headlines will fade in a few weeks, but these are processes that take months. We need to have some discipline and messaging and investigation and accountability to stay with this story even after the headlines fade.
Now, of course, this situation needs to be investigated, as you've mentioned, but in your view, is the state's emergency management system adequately equipped for climate-related disasters like flash floods?
Flooding specifically has been a hot button issue, not only in Texas, but other states as well that are prone to flooding. Here's the thing. We have a lot of technology that can do early warning for flooding. For example, we know that these sensors that showed the river rising, could they be connected to an alarm system? Can they be connected to social media a little bit better? One of the things that we're getting in the reporting in Texas is that while the Weather Service issued traditional warnings, things like Facebook, where a lot of people get their news, that didn't come out until people started waking up and manually putting that into Facebook. And by then the river's up and it's too late. That thing all costs money. And then we get back into the political part of this is like local authorities. Do they need federal money to put in early warning systems? Local authorities can push back on that and say, we don't want it because even though you give us the money ahead of time, we still have to pay to fund it. We have to pay personnel to keep it going. This all gets back to money and politics. And you have multiple layers here. You have a local layer, you have a state level. Sometimes the counties and the local people have separate layers. This is all the political part of these things. And like you mentioned earlier, there's going to be more natural disasters. Instead of the blame game, you need to get into actual real accountability of what worked, what didn't, and what do we need to do for next time. But politics gets in the way of that.
Well, for what everyone needs to do for next time, what needs to happen for people to better prepare for natural disasters like this to prevent such major devastation?
Well, first thing is if you're anywhere near any kind of body of water, no matter how small it is, whether it's a little trickling stream or a river or the ocean or anything else, it will flood. At some point, it's going to flood. And it's a matter of time of when. So people need to be aware of that. They need to be able to probably manage their own social media and other news network feeds of how they get information to make sure they're getting information directly, not just from something like people sharing Facebook posts. You need to get that from the authorities themselves as much as possible. And furthermore, going forward, one of the things that really needs to be done here is the government has to rebuild trust with the community. One of the things in the post-COVID world, whether it's weather, vaccines, anything else, a lot of people just don't trust the government. A lot of that is unfairly not trusting their government. Some of it the government has earned. We need to relearn trust in government authorities, especially people like weather and things like that, depoliticize it a little bit so when people hear information, they believe it and they can act on it.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much for breaking that down for us.
You're very welcome, Theresa.